Alright, welcome back to JavaScript the Basics. In this lesson, we're going to look at arrow functions. What is an arrow function in ES6? Arrow functions, also called fat arrow functions, are a more concise syntax for writing function expressions. They utilize a new token that looks like a fat arrow. Arrow functions are anonymous and change the way this binds in functions. Let's begin by looking at a function expression as we know them in ES5 and how the syntax compares to ES6 and our fat arrow functions. In ES5, in this case, we have a function expression. We have declared a variable called ES5func, and we have assigned it the value of an anonymous function. To help see the direct similarities and differences, I'm going to put this whole function on one line. This anonymous function has no parameters in the parentheses, and then we go into a code block. In this code block, we use the return keyword to return the value of 2. Now, let's look at one way of writing arrow functions in ES6. Let's make some observations. First of all, it is quite a bit less code. The second thing we notice is that the function keyword is gone. For some, this may seem like a lack of readability to someone working with our code. What will establish this as a function to the JavaScript interpreter is the equal sign and the greater than bracket. This is called a fat arrow and lets us know that we are working with an ES6 arrow function. Also, notice the parentheses in the equation. There are times when you may choose not to use the parentheses as well. In this case, it does not have a parameter, so the arrow syntax in this case requires it. We then have the number 2. There is no opening and closing curly braces. We will talk about scenarios in which we may still use them. However, when they are missing, they will implicitly return the following value. We don't have to type in the return keyword. However, if we were to use curly braces around the 2, then we would need to use the return statement to return the value of 2. Let's go ahead and spend the rest of this lesson looking at some of the ways we can write out arrow functions in ES6. You may have a favorite way that you quickly adopt, but awareness of the different possibilities will help you interact with the code of others. Let's look at a few different ways of using arrow functions with one parameter. We'll declare a variable called cubed with the let statement. We equally could have done this with the var keyword as well. In our first example, we don't use a parentheses for the parameter. Because there is only one parameter, in arrow functions, we may choose not to add this code. We then have our fat arrow followed by our parameter multiplied by itself 3 times. Because there are no curly brackets or code block, we will implicitly return the value and do not need to use the return statement. In our second example, we also don't use the parentheses, but because we use a code block as denoted by the curly braces, we have to use a return statement if we want to return the value. In our next 2 examples, we show that we may put our parameters in parentheses as we are accustomed to. Some people consider this a best practice to gain more uniformity in our code for when we look at multiple parameters. After these, we have fat arrows and a missing code block with an implicit return, then another with a code block and an explicit return. So we saw in our first example that with no parameters, the parentheses are required. In our second, we saw that they were optional only with one parameter. Now, let's look at what our syntax is for 2 parameters. We'll start by declaring a variable add with our let statement. We'll then assign our function with 2 parameters to our variable add. If you notice, in both of these examples, the concise body and the block body operate as we have learned in previous examples, and the parameters in this case are required to have parentheses around them if there are 2 or more parameters. Like our first example of no parameters in which we required parentheses, we find the same requirement for 2 or more parameters. Alright, that is all we have for now. I'll see you in the lab where we put what we have learned into practice.